Today we are going to be turbocharging the big block Mopar in my 1973 Dodge Charger. Last week we hit the chassis dyno and the Mopar 361 produced 265 horsepower and a total of about 175 pound-feet of torque, which in my opinion isn't too bad. You got to remember that on an engine dyno, engines are dynoed with the minimal amount of accessories, and on a chassis dyno, it's dynoed with everything on it. So you lose about 75 to 100 horsepower going from an engine dyno to a chassis dyno. Now that we know what this engine makes NA, it was time to hit the track. The only problem is that this car is still operating on the factory torque converter, which in fact I recently checked the stall and it is about 1400 RPMs, and at about 1600 RPMs the engine wants to push past the tires. So really it's 1400 to 1600 RPMs for the stall speed, which is way too low. So in order to replace the torque converter, it was time to drop the transmission, but because this is a long tube header car, the only way to drop the transmission is to remove the headers, and the only way to drop the headers is to remove the torsion bars. And when I finally got around to removing everything to drop the transmission, I said, you know what, when I reassemble this, it's gonna have a turbocharger on it, and that's what we're gonna do today. After we finished up at the dyno last week on Monday, I had the track day on Thursday when I was going to retest the performance. Unfortunately, my opponent for that day could not make it, and so I decided against going by myself to the track. So Friday afternoon, I decided to start tearing everything down to install the torque converter, and by the evening, I decided to build myself a turbo kit for the big block Mopar. That was last Friday. We are on Tuesday of the following week now. I've spent the last 3 days pretty much endlessly fabricating everything to get it all back together. But as you guys can see, there are no signs of a turbocharger anywhere on this car except for this gaping hole in my inner fender. And that's because I have already finished all the fabrication process, and it's basically just time to start the reassembly. When I first installed it, I installed everything dry without any gaskets, and now that I'm going to have the gaskets, things are going to move a little bit, and I'm going to have to do a little bit more fabrication to finish things up. But all the majority of the pieces are all fabricated the way they were supposed to be, and we are all ready to rock and roll. So before we start putting everything back together, I'm going to go ahead and swap the spark plugs out to the spark plugs we're going to go with, and I'm going to gap them to the appropriate gap. I'm also going to be replacing the valve covers, since after the turbo's on, it's going to be kind of a hassle to replace the valve covers. So we're going to be getting rid of the valve covers, and we're going to be swapping out the spark plugs first thing. So I've got the two spark plugs here. The one on the left is a BKR5E. The one on the right is a BKR7E. So the one on the right is actually 2 steps colder than the one on the left. They look identical, and in fact, they're both from the same series. They're both V-Power plugs by NGK, but the difference is that the ceramic is much deeper on the 7 than it is on the 5. And what that allows it to do is it allows the spark plug to run a little bit colder in order to prevent pre-ignition or detonation. Aside from the heat range, we're also going to be changing the plug gap. We're going to go from 035, which is what we were running on the previous spark plug, to 025. If we have a close inspection at the spark plug, we can see that the engine was running a little bit rich, which is to be expected, but also there's a little bit of oil contamination around the electrode, so that's telling me that the engine is burning oil. Considering the heads are fairly new, so the valve seals are going to be new, I'm going to assume that it's going to be from the piston ring, so we are going to have a little bit of blow-by, and in fact, I've noticed blow-by. In the previous video, you guys also might have caught that when the engine decelerated, it was blowing a ton of smoke out the back, which is a telltale sign that the engine is in fact burning some oil. Since the engine's toward the end of its life and requires a rebuild, might as well put a turbocharger on it and see how far we can push this. The reason that we're dropping from an 035 to an 025 spark plug gap is mainly because under pressure, the spark has a harder time jumping the gap. And if the gap is too wide, the boost is actually going to blow out the spark. And if it blows out the spark, you're going to have a misfire and you're going to have to dump all that fuel in the exhaust. So just like we're going to a colder plug, we're also going to a smaller gap in order to prevent problems in the future. The only drawback of doing those two things at the same time is that your low RPM drivability, especially off boost, is going to suffer a little bit. Because the spark plug is running colder, it will tend to foul a little bit easier. So you're going to have to be a little bit more careful on the tune. Also, since the gap is a lot smaller, the spark itself is going to be weaker, and so your idle performance and cold performance is probably going to suffer a little bit as well. As stated before, we are going to be switching out the valve covers. I have a set of sheet metal valve covers. These are made by PRW. They came as a plain aluminum anodized valve cover, and I went ahead and I powder coated them with a wrinkled black powder. So I do think that they look pretty sharp. The only thing is that because I laid on the powder coat a little too thick, A lot of the welds seem to have gotten covered up, but that doesn't necessarily bother me. Another thing is that I had bought the grommets to install a PCV system because I was going to continue running this engine NA, but now that we're going to be running this under boost, I'm not going to need a PCV system. So I'm going to need to buy a different grommet to replace this one so I can install a second filter that looks like this one. Maybe later on I'll install a catch can system, but for now we're just going to go with the double filter method. But we're really strapped for time, so the fastest thing to do is to just install the 2 filters and go on our way. Now that we know where we're going to start, let's go ahead and drop everything in. Alright, so we just finished up installing the spark plugs. I went ahead and I gapped them to 025. I installed the valve covers with the seals and everything's all good to go there. For the exhaust on the passenger side, we're going to be using a stock manifold. This one had a crack in it, but I kind of repaired it. We'll see if it actually holds up. It wasn't leaking too bad, but rule of thumb for turbo cars is you want 0 exhaust leaks. Any type of exhaust leaks, even a little tiny one like this one, would actually affect the way the turbo reacts. And to further push this point, I went ahead and I picked up these gaskets. These gaskets are normally installed on regular naturally aspirated applications that have problem sealing with their headers. They're a really thick flange, you know, like graphite composite gasket, but for a turbo application, these are actually not good. They're really soft, so any kind of back pressure will start to deteriorate these gaskets and start to blow these apart. So I actually purchased the wrong ones. What I should have purchased was the solid copper ones, and those would have been a lot better. But by the time I realized my mistake, it's already too late. I'm only a couple days away from race day, and so this is what I have, and this is what we're going to have to use. We're going to be using the factory fasteners for the exhaust. These are the only ones that fit inside of the manifold correctly, and this is just the neatest way I can find to get everything assembled. Alright, I just finished bolting up the passenger side. That was a little bit of a hassle. The old studs were a little too short because they were cut to fit the headers that I had on there. But now I went ahead and I pulled those studs out, replaced them with longer studs, and then installed the factory hardware. And now I've got the passenger side all good to go. So right now I've got 2 options. I can either go ahead and start on the driver's side, or I can start on the crossover that I have here. I'm still waiting on a few parts, namely the new dipstick, because this one's actually broken. And I don't want to lock myself out of replacing that, so instead we're going to be working underneath the car. But before I can install this crossover, I've actually got to replace the pan. Normally you would just want to take your regular steel pan and just work with what you got, but I do have this deeper pan. It's like a 7 or 8 or 9 quart. I don't even know. I have to actually look it up to see how many quarts this is. This is going to be hanging down like 2-3 inches below my cross member, so it's completely unsafe to drive on the regular street. Unless you insist on living on the dangerous side, I would definitely recommend against getting oil pans like these ones. I got this oil pan at the swap meet, but it's fairly evident as to why it was sold in the first place. It has a ton of damage underneath. It looks like it hit more than a couple speed bumps in its lifetime before it was eventually removed from the car. On the back here, you can tell that there is a repair that was done. So it either smacked off the drain plug or broke it to the point where the drain plug was leaking, and they had to install a different style of drain plug. I've already tested it and made sure that there's no leaks, so this oil pan should be ready to be installed. The next thing I had to do was actually install this turbo drain right here. I went ahead and I welded in this number 10 JIC fitting, and it feeds in right here inside the oil pan. And what this is supposed to do, it's supposed to take the oil that gets drained from the turbo and then it throws them back into the pan. So most of these turbos are oil lubricated, and after the oil gets to the turbo, it has to return itself back into the engine. The safest place to put it has always been the pan, so this is exactly where I decided to put it. I've already made sure that the fitting's not going to hit the rotating assembly, so we are all good there. Now it's just a matter of pulling the old one off and installing the new one. Just pulled off the stock pan. It actually wasn't very difficult. The only areas that were a little bit more difficult than the rest were the 4 bolts in the front sides, these 2 right here, and those 2 right there on that side. Because of the way the cross member is set up, it's actually kind of a hassle to get all the bolts taken out of that. But once you actually get those bolts out, the rest is pretty straightforward. So I went ahead and I dropped it. Last time I did this, I installed a quart gasket, and I attached that quart gasket to the oil pan using silicone. I'm planning to do the exact same thing on the Mylodon pan. It looked like I had a pretty good seal. I didn't have any oil leaks that were coming from the pan, so I'm pretty confident that it's going to go ahead and seal a second time. The only area that I might add a little bit more silicone is on this side, on the same bolts that I had before, and it looks like I didn't get a chance to tighten them all the way, and there was a little tiny bit of seepage here, but not enough to cause any kind of real leak. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of silicone from this bolt to that bolt, and then some from here to there as well, just to cover my bases. Everything else seems pretty solid, so I'm pretty happy about that. Now it's pretty much time to go ahead and get it all assembled, but before I do, I want to go ahead and share something with you guys. So I have a number 10 JIC or AN fitting here, and so you can go ahead and throw this on right here, and as you guys can see, I have plenty of room for the threads to engage, and if I need to install a wrench or something, I have enough room to go ahead and tighten this up. You do have enough room on the bottom to install a tool, but you just want to make sure that this thing spins on freely. You don't want to get this thing all the way to the top and then you won't be able to screw on this hose. So now that I've got the stock pan off, let's go ahead and continue on with the reassembly. So we just finished installing the deep sump oil pan. I also received my dipstick tube. I had to remove the driver's side motor mount in order to install it. And also I bought it from eBay, so it wasn't quite the right shape. A little bit of work with the torch and I was able to bend it and put it back into its place. I already bolted the driver's side motor mount back to where it's supposed to go. And really now it's just time to start putting all the turbo stuff back together. So I've already did the passenger side, time to do the driver's side exhaust manifold and then finish up the crossover. Alright, so this isn't anything fancy or nice or Instagram quality. It actually looks pretty bad, but it is functional. I basically took a set of headers that I had, some old rusted out pieces that we picked up at the swap meet. I cut them up, cut the flanges off, and you guys can tell that there's 3-piece flanges, which we don't really do anymore. Everything is all one piece and nice thick flanges. These are really thin flanges, so you can tell that these headers were pretty cheap, even when they were brand new. The only thing I got to do to this is finish welding it up, and then we're going to install it on the driver's side head. We're going to be going up and over and installing the turbo right around this area. I've already went ahead and cut out the general area where the turbo is going to be, and as you guys can start to tell, this is going to be a very, very tight fit, and I'm hoping after everything's all said and done, I'll still be able to close the hood, but at this point, I'm not quite sure yet, so we're going to have to see. All right, I went ahead and bolted down my turbo manifold on the driver's side. You guys might be wondering why is only one hole welded in with the pipe and the other one is not. And that's because I have the second pipe right here. And the reason that's not in yet is because I need to set up the crossover. There's only a few things left to fabricate, and one of those is the connection between the crossover and the turbo manifold. So there's a little S-bend that I have to make. But before I could do that, I had to make sure the turbo manifold was exactly where it needed to be, and the stock manifold on the passenger side was exactly where it needed to be, because if any of those two positions were to change, the fit up would also change. So I wanted to make sure things were as consistent as possible. So when I was initially building this, I built it out as far as I could, and then I stopped, and now I'm going to go ahead and continue it. So what I have here is a stock 440 flange, and then I built a crossover out of 2.5-inch pipe. The second pipe for the turbo manifold is also built out of 2.5-inch pipe, and I'm merging both of those pipes into a T6 collector flange. Once I have the crossover in place and I finish up the connection between these two pieces, this entire section on the engine side is going to be completely done, and we can focus completely on the turbo. So the hot side is officially finished. I've got everything from the cylinder head all the way to the turbo already completely installed. I've also went ahead and ran some spark plug wires that I had just to see if I had enough clearance. And as you guys can see, I have more than enough clearance. I'm just going to go ahead and tie these up and clean them up and maybe test fire it here pretty soon. This will wrap up part one. Part two, we're actually going to install the turbo itself, and then we're going to install the cold side, which is significantly faster than installing the hot side. So the next episode will be the conclusion of the installation of the carbureted big block Mopar, and then after that we're going to be hitting the track. So I'll see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher out.